Just before starting the Sikha, it's interesting to point out that this Sikha, as we could see at the end of the Sikha, is actually taken from a Maimer of the Rebbe, from Shabbos Parshas Vayetze, Yud Kislev Tovshin Chav Beis. And in that Farbringen, the Rebbe actually said as many as 3 Maimorim. This Sikha being based on the first of those 3 Maimorim. This was a very, very unique thing. It was the very, very only time that the Rebbe should say 3 Maimorim in one Farbringen. And the Rebbe starts off the Sikha by saying that in connection to the bracha that Hashem gives to Yaakov Avinu, saying, "Ufaratz yom avakedma v'tzafoyin v'negva," you're going to burst forth into all directions. Chazal tell us that someone that delights on Shabbos, has pleasure on Shabbos, he's given a heritage without any limitations, without any boundaries, because we have a pasuk that says, "Os tisanag al Hashem," you will delight with Hashem. And then the pasuk goes on and says, "Va'achalticha nachlas Yaakov." I'm going to give you specifically the heritage of Yaakov, which, as Chazal explains, means what's the heritage of Yaakov? That says, "Ufaratzta yom avakedma v'tzafoyin v'negba," different to the way it says by the other avos, with certain limitations. By Yaakov, it speaks about going beyond all limitations. So for keeping Shabbos, for delighting on Shabbos, one gets Yaakov's heritage without bounds, without limits. And what the Rebbe wants to understand in this Sikha is we know that there's a concept called Midah Keneged Midah. Hashem pays measure for measure. What is the connection between the idea of Shabbos and getting this particular blessing, this particular bracha of Nachal of Bli Mitzorim, like it says by Yaakov Avinu? In fact, the Rebbe says we find this by Yaakov Avinu himself, the connection between this idea of Ufaratzta and keeping Shabbos. Because Chazal tell us that by Avraham Avinu we don't find specifically that the Torah should tell us that he keeps Shabbos. And therefore the way he inherits is still again with a certain measure. But by Yaakov Avinu we find that he keeps Shabbos. And this is based on a pasuk where the pasuk says, "Vayichan es pnei ha'ir," he rested. He camped just outside the city. Chazal tell us that he entered the city just before sunset on Shabbos, but first he had set the space for the Tchum Shabbos, the area outside of the city, how far he would be able to walk on Shabbos. And because of this, he gets this unlimited, boundless heritage, which says, the pasuk starts off with saying, "V'hoya zaracha kafar oretz," your children will be like the dust of the earth, and then goes on to say, "Ufaratzta yom avakedma v'tzafoyin v'negba." Now the Rebbe points out that Mefarshim say that of course it doesn't mean Avraham Avinu didn't keep Shabbos. Of course Avraham Avinu kept everything. The pasuk says that Avraham kept by Yishmer Mishmarti, which implies he kept everything, including Shabbos and so on. But what it does mean is that we don't find something specific about Shabbos by Avraham Avinu, only by Yaakov. So since we find that there was something specifically mentioned by Yaakov, and this is why he gets a special bracha, we must say there was some special idea about Yaakov Avinu's keeping Shabbos, that for this he gets this special bracha of Ufaratzta. We also want to focus on the idea of why out of all things of Shabbos, which point does the Torah focus on, this idea of Yaakov setting up the Tchum Shabbos. How is this specifically connected to the bracha of Ufaratzta, of getting this unlimited bracha from Hashem? So what the Rebbe is going to focus on right now, before explaining this, is on a Maimer of the Mendel Rebbe, whose Geula is actually on Yud Kislev, the day the Rebbe said this Sikha or this Maimer. And the Mendel Rebbe explains the uniqueness of the mitzvah of Shabbos to other mitzvahs. And what he says is that by other mitzvahs, since we are doing them through a specific action, there's going to be differences between a great tzaddik, the way he does the mitzvah, and a simple person doing the mitzvah. Whether it's tefillin or other mitzvahs, the tzaddik, because there's a positive way of doing it, so there is going to be differences in the way each person does the mitzvah. However, in Shmirah Shabbos, when we're keeping Shabbos, it's a matter of not doing, we're resting from work. So even though it's true that different people are going to rest from different types of work, but in the very essence of resting itself, everyone's exactly equal. And therefore, by keeping completely this idea of resting on Shabbos, which through this you're also having the complete delight on Shabbos, this itself is already the greatest idea, the greatest pleasure. And why is it specifically regarding Shabbos, this idea that we find that all Yidden are exactly equal in this way of keeping Shabbos? So the Mendel Rebbe explains this based on the idea that the Menucha of Shabbos is really an expression of the very, very deepest part of our neshama, known as the Yechidah, the very essence of the neshama. And this is really why there's no difference between any Yidden in keeping Shabbos because the Yechida is complete by every single Yid. And this is, as we say, the Mittler Rebbe says, we say this in Mincha of Shabbos, Ki me'itcha hi menuchasam, that the Menucha of Shabbos is coming from you, the very, very essence of Hashem. And then we say, Val menuchasam yakdishu es shemecha, that for Menucha of Shabbos, or through the Menucha of Shabbos, they sanctify your name. So in other words, the Menucha, the rest of Shabbos is coming from you, the essence of Hashem himself. And this is why it's connected also with the essence of the Yid, and that's why all Yidden are equal. And this is connected to the idea of Kiddush Hashem as well, the idea of sanctifying Hashem's name, Mesiras Nefesh. This is something which is coming from the Yechida of the Nefesh, and that's why it's by all Yidden exactly the same. Says the Rebbe, this idea that the Yechida of the Nefesh is exactly the same by all Yidden is connected to the concept that we know that in the Neshama there are different levels. And the lower levels of the neshama are more related to the activities of the person, the revelation of the neshama that we call it. But then the yechida is completely beyond that, beyond having any open, direct impact on the person. Chassidus explains we have something called the makifim of the neshama. There's the internal parts of the neshama and there's the makif of the neshama. The part of the neshama that's not impacting you in a direct way, but sometimes a person is inspired with a certain hirur tshuva, with a certain thought of tshuva. He doesn't even know where it came from, and we say this came from a higher part of the neshama called the makif, the all-encompassing part of the neshama. However, the yechida goes even beyond that and further than that. We don't see a direct connection and impact of this level called the yechida on a regular basis inside the person. And this is why Chassidus explains something very interesting. We know we have the clothes of the person, we have the body of the person, we have the clothes of the person. And in the neshama, this would represent, there's the internal koiches of the neshama, the internal faculties of the neshama. And then there is the outer parts, the parts that are more removed from the person, the makif of the neshama, which is like the clothes or the house of a person which surrounds him. But then there is the yechida. Yechida goes even further than that. And Chassidus explains, where does the yechida rest? Not in the body of the person, not even in the clothes or the house, so to speak, of the person, what represents the makifim of the neshama. Rather, what's called the daled amois. A person, Chazal tell us, has his space of 4 amois outside of himself, which are still somewhat his personal daled amois. Now remember, the daled amois are not inside of his house. This is once a person is outside. This is considered completely removed from the person. And this is where the deepest part of the neshama dwells, the part that's not inside the person himself. Says the Rebbe, this is also the reason why we know that specifically on Shabbos we have the halacha called the daled amois. That a person has 4 amois in which the pasuk says, Shvu yishtachtov, a person shouldn't go out of his own space, and you're not allowed to carry outside of daled amois, as we know in the Rishus Harabim and so on, because what's happening is that on Shabbos we have the revelation of the Yechida. And the Yechida specifically dwells where? In the daled amois of the person. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand the connection between the bracha of ufaratzta and keeping of Shabbos. Ufaratzta is a concept of going without any boundaries, without limitations, which ultimately, of course, who is the one without true limitations, is Hashem himself. And that's connected with what? With keeping Shabbos, because as I said before, the keeping of Shabbos is coming from the deepest part within Kvayochel Hashem himself and the etzem of the neshama of the person. Says the Rebbe, this is what's unique about Yaakov Avinu, that by him it specifies the idea of Shabbos. When we say that Avraham Avinu kept all of Torah, including Shabbos, that means it's not in a specific, unique way Shabbos itself, which represents the Yechida. It was part of all of Torah, which in other words is all connected still to lower parts of the neshama. It's specifically by Yaakov, which according to Chassidus, he is the middle column, and it says that the Kavo Emtsoi, we have on the right Chesed, on the left Gevura, and Teferis is in the middle, or Avram on the right, Yitzchak on the left, Yaakov in the middle. He is specifically connected to this idea of revealing and bringing out the deepest part of the Etzem HaNeshama and reaching to the very essence of Hashem. And this is also, the pasuk starts off with saying before Ufaratzta, V'hoya zaracha ka'afara oretz. What's the idea of being like the dust? It's specifically because of the bittul that Yaakov has, that absolute nullification that he feels. This is what's causing that by him, the Yechida, this deepest level of the Neshama, is shining, and that expresses itself in the fact that he keeps Shabbos in this unique way, which again, the keeping of Shabbos, the resting of Shabbos, is something that applies to all Yidden. Says the Rebbe, now we could also understand why we focus on the idea of Tchum Shabbos, Because Tchum Shabbos is a similar concept to the Daled Amos. This is again the space of the person was either the 4 Amos, or sometimes on Shabbos we speak about a further distance of how far you could go out and say this is still considered your space, but it's still the same sort of idea that we say that the Yechidah of the person is shining in the person's area, in the person's space. So in other words, just like the Yechidah shines in the Daled Amos of the person, so too, it also shines within his tchum, and therefore, even though it's true that the Yechidah is connected with the general idea of keeping Shabbos, but even more so with the idea of tchum Shabbos, and this is why we say about keeping Shabbos, and specifically the idea of tchum Shabbos, Chazal related to this idea of bringing out the bli gvul, the nachalo, bli mitzarim in the most unlimited way.